the Cane of Somaria. So this might be one of the coolest Zelda items with the most untapped potential, so for anyone who doesn't know what this item is, I can't really blame you since it was introduced in A Link to the Past way back in 1991, over 3 decades ago, and it hasn't been seen since. And it was an item acquired in the 6th Dark World dungeon, Misery Maya, and in the later part of that dungeon, meaning it never really got a chance to flex its muscles, even in its own dungeon, and there's only 2 dungeons after that one, those being Turtle Rock and Ganon's Tower, and again it doesn't see much use in those dungeons outside of its ability to transform into a platform when used on rails. Now for today I'll be ignoring this function because if I give the block the ability to transform into things, we'll be here all night. So I'll just be focusing on its function as a block. So outside of being used as a platform, it's only used a couple of times in both Turtle Rock and Ganon's Tower, which is a shame considering how much this bad boy can do. So for just a tiny magic cost, you can summon a bright red push block, and it being a push block, its main use is holding down buttons, but in a bit of a twist, it can also be picked up and thrown, allowing it to damage enemies, clear gaps, and hit switches at distances. And after all that, if used again, it can be detonated, which can also be used to hit things. So for one item it does quite a few things, but due to some unfortunate circumstances it never really saw the light of day. I mean, best case scenario, you're playing A Link to the Past randomizer and you get this item super early and you can use it in some of the earlier pushing switch puzzles, making them go by a bit faster, but still not all that useful. But it's in the 3D Zelda games where I think this item could really shine. Like in Ocarina of Time, you gain the ability to climb on blocks because, well, it's a 3D game, which could have a lot of application. For example, this platform in Zora's River, usually accessed by bringing a cuckoo and jumping across the gap. But with the cane, you could plonk down the block, push it right to the ledge, climb on top of the block, and you should be able to clear the gap that way. Then there's some item interactions that I think could be neat with this block as well. It could be used as a hookshot point where you throw it across a gap, then use it as a hookshot point to clear the gap, but I think this interaction would work best if used with the Megaton Hammer. If you hit the block, you can make it slide until it hits something like it does with similar blocks, and this could be used with the hookshot, allowing you to clear much larger gaps. So another interaction the Cane of Somaria block could have is it can float on water, so it can be used as a makeshift platform now, sort of calling back to its use on rails. Now I'm thinking for a puzzle involving an interaction like this would work best in a room like this with flowing water. You use it as a platform where you jump onto it and you would float downstream, where you'd have to shoot switches with your arrows while you float downstream, and you could have some spinning blade traps for you to duck under, giving you something else to pay attention to, and hitting all the switches will open a gate at the end of the room. If you fail, you get sucked up by a vortex and you'll have to try again. Also, another water puzzle involving the cane could utilize the ability to float in water. If you use the cane underwater, the cube, after being summoned, would begin to float to the surface, which could be used to hold down a button on the ceiling, or you could have a switch that's out of range of your hookshot, so you have to use the block's detonation ability to activate the switch. And one more puzzle idea involving the block's ability to float in water, so you could have a button that when pressed down raises the water level of that room for a short period. The water will raise and then drain again, but if you use the cane block on that button, it will put the room into a constant cycle of the water level raising and lowering, and of course you could use the detonation ability, ending the cycle. So I think that could make for a pretty cool puzzle concept. So I'm imagining it could be used in a room like this where raising and lowering the water level also causes hookshot points to raise and lower as well. You could put a bombable wall on a mid-level, so at the water's peak the platform is submerged, but when the water is drained it is not. But the platform cannot be reached without the water level first being raised, allowing you to access the platform first. Then when the water begins to drain again, you have to quickly use your bombs on the bombable wall because bombs don't work underwater. And behind that wall is a switch that can be activated by hitting it, and it raises a gate on the far side of the room, but only for a second. So now you have to navigate to the gate, which will be in a room that you drop down into with bars that you can shoot through. Then when you are next to the gate, you'll be able to see the switch that activates the gate on the other side of the room. The switch would actually be eye level, meaning the platform you are standing on is mid level, meaning it can also be submerged in water. So you can only use your bow when the water level is down, so you hit the switch and pass the gate, which will put you into a shaft-like room with a button on the floor that will open the gate that you just passed, preventing a soft lock. if you move the block from the button that raises the water level. If you did not remove the block, the water level will shortly raise again, allowing you to float up to the exit. So yeah, they are just some of the puzzle ideas I could come up with for an item like this in Ocarina of Time. So now I want to talk about Majora's Mask. So for that game, if Nintendo ever decides to remaster the game, I don't think anybody would mind if they made the tiny change and just gave you the Cane of Somaria instead of the Elegy of Emptiness. So for this game, the cane would have to allow you to summon up to 3 blocks at a time instead of just 1, which could open up some new puzzle concepts for some of the puzzles in the Stone Tower. Like now you could have a puzzle around stacking 3 blocks on top of each other, and another puzzle revolving around the concept that you can only have 3 blocks at a time, so trying to summon another one would cause the oldest one to detonate. It would work a lot like Cryosis from Breath of the Wild now that I think about it. So a puzzle could be you have 3 switches that need to be activated in a certain order and then deactivated in a certain order. And of course the cane in Majora's Mask would have the same functionality as the one that I've already discussed in Ocarina of Time, so I'm not going to go through all that again. So now we'll move on to Twilight Princess, since I can't really think of any new way it could be used in Wind Waker other than it can float on water. So you could use the Deku Leaf to propel yourself across the water like you can do with this flower thing, but I think that could be a bad thing, because couldn't you then just leave the King of Red Lions by sailing off with your block into the ocean? So we'll move on to Twilight Princess to avoid any of those complications. And again, it would still have all the functionality from Ocarina of Time carried over, but Twilight Princess has some really cool sliding block puzzles, pun absolutely intended, that could be enhanced by having the Cane of Somaria. I especially like this last one in this room, where you have to use the blocks in the room to manipulate the position of the next block that you push, and you build off of each block that you push until you can reach the button in the center. I think having to position the cane block to manipulate the regular blocks is a neat concept for a puzzle, and I know what you're thinking, couldn't you just dump the cane block on the button and skip the puzzle? But there's an easy solution to this problem. Firstly, you just add another button for your cane block to hold down once you've moved the bigger block into position, but if you move into the next room and detonate the block removing it from the button, you could potentially soft lock yourself. So better solution, you make the button bigger, indicating that it can only be held down by one of the bigger blocks, like this switch from Majora's Mask. So that's it for Twilight Princess. Then there's Skyward Sword, and like Wind Waker, there's not too much new I could really come up with for this game. There is Link's new ability that he got where you can slightly run up walls, and having a block could let you get to even higher places by climbing on the block first and then running up the wall. But this is a puzzle that the game already uses a couple of times, like here in the Lanai Remining Facility and in Skyloft, but other than that, I really just don't think this is the game for the cane. But if you have any ideas of some of the new functions you could have in Skyward Sword or Wind Waker, I would love to hear it. So moving on, now for most of these games I've talked about so far, I think there's a lot of really cool puzzle potential that could arise from the implementation of the cane into those games, even though I think Majora's Mask is really the only game that should actually incorporate this item, since it's basically just a straight upgrade to the Elegy of Emptiness with more utility and it being much less tedious to use. But so far, all this potential has just been a dip in the kiddie pool for these games. But there is one game that could utilize this item so well, it's kind of insane, and that game is of course Breath of the Wild. So before you even get this item in this game, there's potential. So I'm thinking there could be a larger structure found somewhere in Hyrule. I actually think this Colosseum building would be perfect for this. Firstly, there's no hole in the wall, meaning the only way to enter this structure is from the top, and you could make it multi-layered where you have to beat all enemies on a floor before being able to access the next floor. So I think there should be a few more enemies per floor, something like 9. First floor they start with bokoblins, for the next floor it's lizarfos, then moblins, and finally the Lynel on the bottom floor. I also think the building should be moved to the Hebra area, since you can see a few remains of structures in this region, so I think it would fit nicely here, and you would be able to see it from quite a few locations in Hyrule, drawing the player's attention since it's a tall tower-like structure, and since it's further away from the start of the game, you could make the enemies inside a bit harder, making them black variations of each, except for the Lynel, which could be a guaranteed silver. Then once you defeat the Lynel, one of these rooms that has the bars in front of it will open up, allowing you to go deeper into this area. There could be a few traps to avoid and some light puzzle solving for you to do, but I don't think it would be any more crazy than your run-of-the-mill shrine. Once you do that, you get a chest with a Cane of Somaria in it, and the cane goes into your weapon category and has unlimited durability. When used, it summons a red block like normal. The block is a little larger than normal, so I'm thinking it would be somewhere in between these two blocks in terms of size, meaning it's too heavy to push around. So before you're able able to leave the area, there's a puzzle that teaches you how the cane block works. There's a room with a button on an elevated platform, and the button is too big to be pressed down by your weight, and since the platform is elevated, you can't just dump the cube directly onto the button since you can only summon it directly in front of you and at eye level. So you swap to your magnesis ability, and it turns out the cube is metal despite its red appearance. So you solve the puzzle by picking up the cube with magnesis, then you put it on the button, allowing you to leave. Then you are back in the room where you fought the Lionel, and in the corner of the room there is a big button that you would have noticed before but you couldn't do anything with since you did not yet have the cane. Then you use the cane to put the cube on the button, and that opens the set of large wooden doors on the bottom floor of this building where the hole in the wall normally is, allowing you to leave the building without having to walk all the way back up to the top. So now that you have the cane in hand, there is so much potential. So we just learned from the puzzle before that the cube that you summon is metal, which also means it can conduct electricity, so it can be used in electricity puzzles. Now one thing that I want to say is I don't think any puzzles in the game should be altered in any way, meaning you have a metal block at your disposal that you normally would not have. So basically what the cane would allow you to do in this game is cheese a lot of the game's shrines, but I think it's okay for it to do that since most of Breath of the Wild shrines are so basic you don't need a cheese method, since it would actually be more simple to just solve the puzzle. Also, if a slightly more complicated shrine does show up, it's usually not that hard to find a cheese method for it anyway, so adding an item that allows you to cheese puzzles but is designed to let you and help you cheese them is a fun addition to the game. Also, the way that you get the cane is through fighting a bunch of tough enemies, so if you want it early you have to be skilled enough to earn it, which also adds a little bit of routing to the game, which I'm all about. Like after I leave the Great Plateau, I would head straight for Hyrule Castle and get the Hylian Shield and a bunch of powerful weapons I would need to tackle all the enemies in the tower, preventing me from getting the cane. And that tiny bit of routing with the addition of just one item has already got me thinking about this game in ways the normal game just never does. It's crazy to me to think Nintendo could have had items like this in the game, but they didn't. I personally think the Breath of the Wild format with a Zelda game's core altered slightly could be a recipe for a truly fantastic game, and obviously the hookshot that I talked about in my first Breath of the Wild video could be implemented in a very similar way to how I suggested the cane could be. Like you find it in a building like the cane, but this one would be in the Faron region since I think the hookshot would fit that area's jungle theme pretty well, and all this shows me that this format could work really well. Now I understand the ideas that I've come up with at this time are just on paper, so maybe in reality it might not work as well as I think, but I really can't see Breath of the Wild being worse off because of items like this. Anyway, tangent over, now let's get back to what this bad boy can truly do. So since the cane summons a block, it means you also have a physics object at your disposal, meaning it can also be used with stasis. And since it's a medium-sized block, it's big enough for you to climb onto, meaning you can also stasis fling yourself around Hyrule whenever you want. And if you combine this with the weak unlimited durability weapon I suggested should be in the game in my second Why Breath of the Wild Sucks video, you would be able to stasis fling yourself everywhere around Hyrule, which would open up a lot more possibilities and make the game more fun. Also, I think it's interesting that the cane would also enhance magnesis at the same time, because one thing that sucks about magnesis is if there is no metal object, magnesis literally does nothing. So now that you have a metal object at your disposal at all times, it actually improves magnesis. For example, if a guardian spots you, you can just use this block as cover and block the laser, or just break the line of sight of the guardian. And in a normal combat scenario, while I still don't think it would be that useful, you can use the cane block as a weapon, and at the very least you always have that option, which I think is cool. And there's more. Again, since the block is a physics object, it would have weight, meaning it could be used in weight puzzles. It would also be good for block stacking puzzles. I also think that it could have a unique interaction with your bomb, so if you summon a block, then use it again, it normally detonates like an explosion, so I think giving it actual explosion properties could be cool, but that might make bombs redundant, so I think you should first have to load up the cube with one of your bombs where the core of the cube will then be blue, indicating that it will explode if unsummoned, giving it even more combat utility. Like you could pick up the cube with magnesis, then drop it into a crowd of enemies, then detonate it, breaking up the crowd, allowing for easy pickings. Also, side note, I think if you put a bomb into the cube, it'll increase the explosion radius slightly. The explosion would also deal damage based off of the status of the bomb that you put into the cube. So a normal bomb only deals 12 damage and a bomb's plus bomb deals 24. And if unsummoned without using a bomb in the cube, it will just poof. So that leaves Cryosus as the last of the Sheikah Slate abilities to have a cool interaction with the cube, but Cryosus just kinda sucks, so there wouldn't really be one. Obviously you can put the cube on top of the Cryosus pillar, but I can't see that being super useful in most situations since it can only be used on water. The only time I think this would help is in that one DLC shrine where you normally climb up using an ice block. Now you can use the Somaria cube instead. Maybe there's another shrine that I can't remember that has a similar concept, but other than that, it's not super useful. So in conclusion, Cryosus sucks. And that's about it for the Cane of Somaria and the IDs I could come up with for its uses in the franchise. So there's a bunch of really cool potential puzzle concepts that could arise from the implementation of this item. Majora's Mask and Breath of the Wild are the main games that benefit from this item. Majora's Mask because it would replace a tedious and unfun thing to use and open up some new puzzle concepts for the final dungeon of the game. So Nintendo, if you're watching, please consider it. It would make the only sour part of that game way better. Now I know that does ruin how each dungeon has a song required to enter the dungeon, but that's not something that can't be changed, and if you really wanted to keep the song, you could just give it a specific location like the rest where it needs to be played in order to gain access to the dungeon, and that's it. And for Breath of the Wild, an item like this being found somewhere in the world gives players something real to explore for, and an item like this is a game changer with so much utility, and it wouldn't be just limited to this item. You could have a bunch of classic items found around the world in mini dungeon-esque locations, and that would give players something worthwhile to track down, and to make consecutive playthroughs more interesting since now you have permanent additions to your arsenal like a normal Zelda game. So that's everything that I wanted to talk about with the Cane of Somaria. I would love to hear if you have any ideas or puzzle concepts involving this item, especially for Wind Waker and Skyward Sword, games I couldn't really come up with anything for. It would also be nice to know if anybody else loves this little item as much as I do. So thanks for watching, I hope you had fun watching this video. So see you next time.